Welcome to the first session of Sapient Cinema by Laurence. From anthropogenic climate change to recent global pandemic, the necessity to think through pitfalls and possibilities of human action on world stage has never been more pressing. This seminar will explore how contemporary popular cinema has been engaged in the task of world making that rethinks the potential of human agency. Doing so requires reassessing the ability to think through universally and properly defining the role of reason in theoretical and political analysis. As the feminist collective Laboria Cuboniks states, global complexity opens us to urgent cognitive and ethical demands, such that emancipatory politics hinges upon profound reworking of the universal. Since the rise of computer science and the engineering of machinic life, this has become the question of intelligence, as seen in films such as those dealing with cognitive drug enhancement, including Lucy 2014 and Limitless 2011. The recent spate of cinematic explorations of artificial intelligence, such as Transcendence 2014, The Wandering Earth 2019, Ex Machina 2014, and 2.0 in 2018, as well as the tradition of cinema concerned with hacking of consciousness, such as Paprika 2006, Possessor 2020, and Neptune Frost 2021. Catherine Malabou says that the return of intelligence was one of the most important theoretical issues of early 21st century and contemporary popular cinema, especially since science fiction is reflecting these concerns. Popular films provide contradictory and often surprising objects of study for an analysis of contemporary perspectives on rationality, revealing insidious assumptions that the concept of reason has historically gained. Its gendered, ableist, and racist portrayals, while also providing space where constellations of ideas around autonomy, agency, politics, and community are being perpetually renegotiated. These films offer valuable insights into contemporary tasks of rethinking rationality and designing the future, figuring ways of an often misplaced pessimism surrounding theoretical appraisals of human action. Laurence, the instructor of the seminar, is a digital film and television lecturer at University of Bristol. In 2020, he completed his PhD in Film Studies Department of King's College London, exploring metaphysics of Deleuze cinematic philosophy. He has been a module conveyor at KCL, an associate lecturer at University of Arts London, and a tutor at Met Film School. Laurence has published on various topics within film theory and philosophy, from Deleuzian ethics, experimental cinema, Hollywood action film, archiving practices, and anti-colonial aesthetics. His articles and book reviews have appeared in Film Philosophy, Alphaville, Studies in World Cinema, PLI, the Warwick Journal of Philosophy, and Frame Cinema Journal, amongst others. His current research is on representation of sapient intelligence in contemporary popular film and the techniques of cinema's own form of alien intelligence that makes this possible. I'm now going to pass the mic to the instructor. Laurence, the mic is yours.
Pradeep, thank you so much. It's so great to see so many people here. So thank you for coming and for joining this course. I hope it's going to be enjoyable. I hope it's going to be sort of informative, and hope we can get a discussion going about some of these films. Not all necessarily great films, some very good films, some films that almost fail because their ideas kind of overspill the possibilities of their sort of genres or their sort of forms in different ways. And I'm excited because there's lots of, as I sort of detail, lots of this project is kind of, interdisciplinary and sort of like thinks through questions of intelligence, and obviously AI comes up a bit today. Lots of these areas fairly, outside of my own specialism, which is within sort of film theory, film philosophy. So I'm sure there'll be people here who can sort of, add and contribute to this debate, this conversation, and help me to think through these ideas as well, if I could say so. This is a project that I've been sort of thinking about on and off for quite a while now. And I'm sort of working out what to do with it at the moment. I keep on returning to some of the ideas, this question of sort of cinema's negotiation of intelligence. So it's sort of, although it's been in the works for a while, it's still at this sort of nascent stage. So I've sort of, in the sort of readings and the films for each week, kind of paired some of the ideas that I'm thinking with the films to sort of hopefully spark a debate about how these things can be brought together. So what I do first now is to sort of like introduce the short course, sort of give a sort of background to where I came at it from, sort of how I came to these sort of texts, these films, and sort of what I think is interesting, or what I think we can get from this kind of analysis, and sort of reflect on what kind of methodologies we might use to understand these kind of analyses before sort of going through the film and sort of picking out some quotes from the reading, just the ones that I thought might be interesting or relevant for understanding of Transcendence, the film we're talking about today. Hopefully you've all had a chance to watch and alongside the readings. I mean, in a nutshell, this short course is about how popular contemporary cinema, this sort of current wave, I'm going back 2014, is obviously Transcendence, and then Lucy next week. How these contemporary popular films negotiate some kind of idea of intelligence, and the kind of constellation of concepts around intelligence, such as agency, selfhood, community, for example, getting on to questions of sort of sapience, and especially next week, more sort of this idea of, what is sapience? What is the sort of ways in which reason works for humans, different from sort of sentient intelligence and animal intelligence, and what are the kind of obligations and responsibilities that within sort of philosophical thinkings of that idea sort of assume, or sort of the concept of sapience encompasses those ideas, and how popular film, with its often quite problematic representations of intelligence, and can be related to those things. So it's sort of, in one way of thinking about it, it's trying to think through how these films might relate to contemporary discourses of sort of neo-rationalist philosophy, rationalist inhumanisms, as Pete Wolfendale in the text this week explained so brilliantly. I wanted to see how cinema might relate to these discourses. And it's sort of probably to say early on, obviously, although this week is at least sort of ostensibly the film is about AI in some sense. It's sort of not a project which is solely about sort of artificial intelligence, but more what those discourses reveal about intelligence in general, how sort of, film has tropes, around AI, but those often just reveal what was sort of already assumed thinking was in the first place, or intelligence was in the first place. So in one sense, it's, can these films, these sort of popular films, often sci-fi films, add something to our understanding of rationality, thinking, intelligence, sapience, etc.? In one sense, there's a kind of cultural studies perspective, which I think is important. Is cinema kind of symptomatic of current sort of almost like spontaneous ideological assumptions underpinning how we and specific cultures think intelligence works? So you see these films sort of setting up binaries and setting up oppositions between different kinds of thinking, between sort of different kinds of ways of being in the world, different ways of different sort of ethics and morality around sort of, what intelligence is, or sort of what politically viable options for exploring intelligence, or sort of, resistance groups in the case of the neo-Luddites in Transcendence. So in this way, there's a sort of sense in which what we need to do perhaps is kind of critique these films. We need to say these films are about intelligence, but with intelligence, there's this sort of ideological underpinning of them that needs to be critiqued. I mean, one of the things to mention from the beginning is intelligence is a dirty word, and quite rightfully a dirty word. Its history, its use in the sort of exclusion and extermination of peoples historically is clear and apparent across time. So what intelligence means is tricky in this question of how we use it as a term, how we sort of operate with this sort of the conceptual baggage that this word brings is really important. But I feel like it is important precisely because that's what these films are doing. These films are trucking in some concept of intelligence that needs to be unraveled. So there's this kind of cultural studies, or even sort of ideology critique version of this approach that needs to be sort of reckoned with. How, we need to say what these films are doing bad, politically bad and dangerous, and that need to be sort of understood as us as critics, or something like that. As well as this, I kind of want to think through, what film specifically adds to our understanding of this. This is sort of coming from film theory, and as I explained, kind of film philosophy, more than just examining how film represents technologies and sort of human, superhuman, sort of non-human intelligences. What's the role of cinema itself as a technology? What's its role in sort of propagating ideology as a specific mechanism of the state, but also how is it part of and constitutive of kind of contemporary experience as a sort of part of the technological field, as sort of the media ecosystem, I guess. What's specific about cinema's representations of intelligence, and how is cinema able to represent thinking? How can sort of thinking happen on screen? How is it sort of able through both its sort of technological bases, but also, you know, its genres and its sort of like culturally based forms. How is it able to show someone thinking? You know, one of the first things to mention is, you know, and it comes up in Transcendence, the kind of genius trope, you know, numbers floating around on the screen, for example, or sort of, you know, people with dirty shirts, as I'll show later, you know, people whose can be presented as intelligent on screen precisely because they lack other qualities. You know, suddenly empathy is lost in a character. Suddenly they can't sort of think in other ways. Intelligence has this sort of very narrow definition often within these sort of films. So how is film able to visualize, and sort of narrativize, and present to us different kinds of thinking as a technology? And the sort of, you know, specifically film philosophical methodology or sort of aspect of all this, which is slightly more tricky, is this question of sort of what kind of thinking cinema is. And this is the sort of cornerstone of quite a lot of, you know, sort of film philosophy as a sort of specific discipline, which sort of tries to say, you know, film is not just a representational mechanism. It doesn't just perhaps illustrate forms of thought or illustrate philosophies. You know, if you've seen those books, you know, the philosophy of the Matrix, for example, or the philosophy of Game of Thrones or something. You know, it's about how do these cultural objects kind of illustrate our concepts. You know, if you're in a philosophy department, perhaps you can play a film and it'll be useful for helping to communicate Cartesian dualism to students, for example. You know, film can be illustrative, but a film philosophical approach, sort of indebted, as you've read in one of the articles this week, indebted to a sort of lineage of film theory and film philosophy, going back to sort of Sean Epstein, to Gilles Deleuze, who's sort of one of the most important for this, to more recent work, is that film thinks in some ways, and even, and more trickily, obviously, with the sort of film as AI question, film has an intelligence, or can, you know, revitalize or reorient what we think intelligence is in the first place. So I'm hoping these different strands might kind of come together in the next 4 weeks, with the sort of different papers that look through, you know, different kinds of intelligence, representations within science fiction and the cultural studies perspective, as well as these sort of questions of how is the film specifically thinking its topic, or what can it mean to say that film is thinking in the first place? So what I want to do is sort of give an introduction to just myself and the kind of where I came at this project from, or sort of like where it started and how it sort of developed, and perhaps where I might see it going, just to give you a kind of background to all of this. I mean, essentially for me, it started with Lucy, which is the Luc Besson film we're going to watch next week. And if anyone's seen it, it's totally nuts and doesn't make any sense. And it's brilliant and amazing and awful in some ways. It barely sort of makes sense. But it's a film that is optimistic to a fault, right? It's sort of, if you've seen it already, I don't want to ruin the ending if you haven't seen it, but I mean, I will ruin a little bit, which is that, you know, they discover the meaning of life at the end of this film. So it's very sort of like techno utopian in some ways. So this film sort of utopian optimism was what struck me. I remember I went to go see it in 2014 and can, you know, believe it. It was also the time I was sort of reading lots of accelerationist writing at the time. So it was sort of, oh, this is so exciting. I can write about this film and accelerationism and develop some of those ideas. So I did around then. It was when I was doing a master's at King's College London at the time in sort of film philosophy or film theory and philosophy, and wrote about it as it was sort of coming out, building on what Stephen Shaviro terms as sort of accelerationist aesthetics. The module, in fact, and I think this is important, was part of this sort of introduction to German language, a sort of German language tradition of aesthetics, like Frankfurt School, Benjamin, Walter Benjamin's kind of work, that was trying to think about the relationship between cinema and experience and modernity. So what I tried to do is to sort of, you know, this course being about sort of how modern subjectivities at the beginning of the 20th century were sort of formed and fractured through the cinematographic mechanism and, you know, mechanical reproduction, etc. What I tried to do is to then think about how there's a parallel between how 20th century early 20th century cinema related to the shocks of modernity, and how a sort of post-cinema, if that's a sort of term that is often bandied around, especially by Chaviro, to understand sort of cinema in its different position within sort of different kinds of technologies and different kinds of media forms, how, Lucy in particular, but we can sort of spread it to other films, how those films might relate to the contemporary world, sort of how it sort of mirrors or enacts the shocks or whatever kind of complementary concept you might say, how it negotiates a kind of contemporary experience of the world. So writing on aesthetics in the kind of post-cinematic age, Stephen Chaviro posits the ability of art to, as he says, help and train us to endure and, quote, perhaps also to negotiate changing political landscapes. And Chaviro's argument is rooted in Walter Benjamin's conception that film in the earliest 20th century, quote, corresponds to profound changes in the apperceptive apparatus. And it is through, quote, shock effects that film can induce heightened attention. So what I did in this essay, which I'm not saying was particularly successful, but it was fun, was compare this film, this sort of contemporary sci-fi film, to Hans Richter's Rhythmus 21, the sort of abstract series of abstract shapes that he made in 1921, and Dziga Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera from 1929, and that relationship with modernity in those films, to try and understand Lucy in relationship to sort of capitalist realism, or sort of some notion of a contemporary, if that was the term I was using at the time, exemplifying, this negotiation of the organizing principles of the contemporary world. I mean, importantly, sort of Chaviro doesn't really see this as like a political strategy as such. He kind of posits that it's not through sort of cognitive mapping, but sort of through sort of affective and sensory mapping of the world that these contemporary films might be said to sort of help us negotiate the world. And there's a kind of sense in which these films, in training us to understand the world that is today, and this comes up with this sort of, often in these films, those fast digital landscapes that sort of appear as Woolcaster and Transcendence kind of goes into the digital. These sort of like speeds and these sort of affective engagements with a sort of contemporary ecological media ecology ameliorate us to sort of the demands of today in some ways. And there's this sort of fatalism rooted deep in the core of Chaviro's work, which is really explicitly said. He writes the quote, intensifying the horrors of contemporary capitalism does not lead them to explode, but it does offer us a kind of satisfaction and relief by telling us that we have finally hit bottom, finally realized the worst, which is bleak, but interesting. And is what sort of got me thinking about these kind of ideas in relationship to Lucy at first. I mean, I spent the few years after that not thinking about Lucy. As Pradeep said, I kind of wrote my thesis. Doctoral work was on Gilles Deleuze and film philosophy more generally. And I did engage with sort of the digital and the post-cinematic, but I actually ended up writing about Transformers, which is sort of, painful because the films are unbearable, but it's precisely their sort of unbearable sort of overload that was interesting, this kind of total loss of agency and sort of selfhood and sort of the experimental filmmaking that almost accidentally appears through Michael Bay's Transformers film. But my thesis kind of finished ultimately with a sort of dissatisfaction with Deleuze's philosophy, sort of diagnosing of kind of an emptiness of unethical or political gestures in sort of an obsession with becoming or metaphysical production that leaves no room, or potentially no room, and this is complicated, obviously, for like agency, navigation, etc. And this is then when I turned back to Lucy into other films from that time and onwards, defined my sort of shift in focus, not sort of just obsessed with the speed and the sort of techno-utopianism of Lucy, but that there was something more interesting going on with the question of intelligence in some ways. The final line of my thesis was sort of this flippant kind of piss take where I sort of said that moving away from Deleuze's work, that we might require like a new metaphysics for a new times or something. We need to sort of like have some sort of new way of viewing the world that takes into account or allows us to think through the agential for political purposes, right? And although it's kind of a joke, it became then the basis for what I wrote about Lucy sort of a few years after that. So this is kind of perhaps like cheap self-narrativization, but in my mind, maybe Lucy and that kind of film was in the background the whole time, the sense in which within these films, as well as sort of often sort of just acclimatizing you to the speed of contemporary digital technologies and life, there's also sort of moments where something more interesting or something to do with agency and community and selfhood is sort of being explored. And I keep on coming back to this film. Now it's been nearly 10 years since it came out, sort of like writing on again and again. And we'll watch that one for next week, but I think it sets up what we're thinking about today. Because yeah, as I said, the sort of original engagement is quite simplistic, of just sort of being obsessed with speed. And there's a sort of political imperative then to think through the possibility of navigation of contemporary conditions and not just amelioration, going for action and not acceptance. And this question of the political imperative versus how we read the films is obviously another part of maybe what we can speak about. I mean, Pradeep's already kind of read out my justification for this course, as you've read on Ian New Centre's page. But it is that political imperative, the sense of, from sort of climate change to sort of the pandemic, this question of sort of thinking through human action becomes more and more pressing and requires, or has been said to require, right, the reassessing of universal thinking and the role of reason within these sort of theoretical, practical, political analyses and sort of practice. So yeah, Laboria Cuboniks say so themselves, right? They say, global complexity opens us to urgent cognitive and ethical demands, such that emancipatory politics, quote, hinges on a profound reworking of the universal. And that question of how these films, as we'll see, negotiate a universal or sort of try to, but always slip back into, the parochial and the sort of like self-interested and the nationalistic, etc., is a big part of what I want us to talk about. I mean, and the question of intelligence then I think becomes quite important. And since the rise of computer science, machine life, this has become an important question. And this quote you just heard about from Catherine Malabou, that this return of intelligence as a concept is, as she says, one of the most important theoretical issues of the 21st century. So this led to this attempt to put the films in conversation with contemporary neo-rationalist philosophies who have made this, there's been, an interesting development of sort of accelerationist thinking into sort of like neo-rationalist thought, according to people like Pete Wolfendale, Reza Negrostani, Thomas Moynihan, amongst others that are interested in reassessing this notions of intelligence or rationality in the face of these contemporary crises. As you heard as well, like, my pitch here and my sort of the platform that I want us to sort of start from is that, popular films provide these kind of contradictory, but often, sometimes surprising objects of study because they both reveal these sort of ideological underpinnings, the sort of common sense assumptions, the concepts of intelligence, reason, rationality, but crude, sort of like often sort of Enlightenment hang-ups, perhaps often, built in with the same sort of, race, ableist, sort of sexist, ways of thinking of the intelligent or the intelligence or genius, as films often like to portray it. But while also providing these spaces where kind of constellations around those ideas, such as autonomy, agency, politics, community, are being sort of reworked and sort of, I think we can get something interesting from these films. And I don't think it's always just a case of, I mean, the sort of fear in all of this is that it's sort of, it's in the eye of who's ever doing the analysis, and these films are just sort of like, the films are there, and I'm sort of, you get it to say what you want it to say in order to write an essay or make a point, and that's part of this sort of methodological question of what are these films doing? Are sometimes they sort of almost accidentally doing something quite promising, or are we, how do we even judge them? I think that's a really important question. So we're taking this wave of popular cinema as featuring sort of expanded or artificial human or artificial intelligence, sort of indexing changing attitudes to rationality and universal thinking. So across these weeks, I want to sort of explore the kind of cultural moments, the sort of socio-historical movements that produce these interrogations of human agency within climate crisis, within sort of like specific contemporary crises, both in the sort of Western context, but then also with sort of, across sort of post-colonial consciousness as well, coming from the global South. Hollywood and world cinemas provide these sites where cultural anxieties around intelligence have manifested, both sort of mystical rejections of the rational, as well as sort of overzealous attachments to a notion of intelligence engineering and machinic life and the artificial aspect of AI. And I think it's by assessing these sort of the futural thinking that these cultural products have within them that we can kind of uncover and critically assess potentially the sort of nascent possibilities of radically different futures that exist within our current moment. And that's the political claim that we'll go into. As we'll see, I mean, this will involve sort of reckoning with sort of other ways of thinking. As I said, it's with, we're reading Pete Wolferdale's work today, as well as work sort of responding to or within the tradition of sort of post-humanism. There is a sense in which, one could claim that the sort of humanities often lack the proper necessary tools to sort of grasp the importance of a kind of sapient intelligence, exemplified by trends such as the post-human, that sort of undermine the picture of the human as a rational animal, which potentially has sort of consequences for figuring a kind of global agency. As I've said, sort of intelligence itself as a concept has a problematic, to put it lightly, history rooted in sort of failed genetic dogmas around IQ tests, proposed racial disparities that paved the way for aborted experiments in eugenics, for example. So this sort of post-human response to this, epitomized by philosophers such as Rosie Bidotti, Gretchen Hales, valorizes materiality, non-human agency, in order to unseat those kind of grand narratives of rationality and universal valuations, where the universal is always just sort of a bloated particularity, is always sort of just taking a specific sort of like white male European vision of thinking of intelligence and sort of like disproportionately expanded it out beyond its remit. Within film theory and philosophy, these thinking is, this kind of work is also quite prominent. Lots of sort of engagement with sort of animal intelligence, with squids, for example, in cinema. Some really fantastic work there. But again, it's sort of interrogating cinema in relationship to these sort of animal or sort of non-human intelligences. There is often this sort of elision or sort of ignoring of a sentient sapient distinction that we want to question maybe in this course, or to try and think through what can be gained by keeping these terms or that distinction, and what is lost, and what is politically dangerous about doing some thinking about some of those ideas. I mean, within film theory, it is kind of, there's a longer story one could tell about the sort of like changing landscape of discourse, I guess. Phenomenology, affect theory, which has sort of like some interesting sort of an interesting place within sort of more contemporary post-humanist thinking, is this sort of important moment in the 90s which takes over and rejects a sort of like obsession with psychoanalysis that reigns from the sort of 70s to the 90s, essentially, to put it maybe simplistically. But there is a sense in which the sort of phenomenological and even the affective is a kind of somatophilia, like an obsession with the body, the sort of the pre-reflective knowledge, the sort of subject who's Vivian Subject, who's an incredible scholar, but it's to do with sort of what your fingers know. There's a kind of there's a sort of a sense of a sort of pre-reflective form of engagement and sense that one must get to in the sort of cinema experience. And perhaps these sort of somatophilic, if I can call those that, approaches can sort of fall limp in view of calls for universal thinking or rationality, etc. This idea that sort of understanding the possibilities of human action today requires sort of assessing or reassessing the aspects of intelligence that distinguish humans from other life forms, namely the distinction between sentient animal life and sapience, the sort of ability for humans to reason. I mean, Negrostani, for example, says it's not the sort of superiority of human thinking, but it's the sort of significance of it and what it can do. And I think that's something that will be part of, not something we have to sort of stick to or sort of be dogmatic about in any sense, but one that is sort of, how does how do these ideas appear in these films, or what are these films doing that can sort of what do these ideas help us see in the films, or sort of help us critique in the films themselves as well. So as you've seen with the sort of 4 weeks of the course, this week is sort of transcendence and questions of AI. I mean, next week, Lucy, the more bizarre one, but techno-optimism, but also, place, space, etc. Different kinds of humanism, sort of transhumanism, inhumanism, post-human, etc. Before we move on to, in the third week, the Wandering Earth, and these sort of like questions of sort of collective intelligence, questions of sort of the relationship between the universal and sort of geopolitics, and how movements towards the universal or the planetary obviously contain within them that kind of national interest and specific the politics that film is doing in interesting ways. For Neptune Frost, which is a fantastic musical sort of Afrofuturist film that will sort of provide a different perspective on these questions, sort of gender hacking and anti-colonial resistance. There's some methodological stakes just to flag quickly. I mean, when we sort of watch these films, especially when we're watching them within a sort of academic environment, where we're going to have to say something about them, right? Or we should say something about them. In some ways, there's kind of two extremes we might come to in our engagement with these films. They're not, and they don't have to be coherent as we want them to be, because they probably won't be. They don't need to be in many different ways. When you watch these films, the sort of incoherence of what's going on, or the contradictions that seem to come about, and we could call it bad filmmaking, we can call it bad storytelling. That might be one way of thinking about it, but they're not going to provide sort of direct insights or theoretical propositions, perhaps, because they are deeply contradictory objects. Even when they're brilliant texts, they can be contradictory, and I think that's what's interesting about them. So we might do sort of violence to a film by sort of trying to align it directly to a set of ideas or positions, or in fact, we might miss the importance of unraveling these contradictions if we just take their kind of confusing nature as sort of, oh, well, they're just confused, and we don't need to sort of get too hung up on sort of the bizarre dichotomies or sort of moments in transcendence that just barely make any sense from the perspective of sort of the ideas that we bring to it. And I think that meta question then sort of flags that sort of wider point, right? That sense in which, what can film do here? But how can it help us? And what can we, what do we learn or sort of better understand about the ideas, specifically as they sort of negotiated culturally, ideologically in different ways? Good. I mean, I've got sort of slides that I want to go through, just sort of some of the ideas that I think come out in the film, but I've been talking for a while, I feel already. So I do want to ask how I mean, if you've had a chance to watch the film, how you found the film, if you've seen it before, or yeah, I just wanted to open it up now to sort of your thoughts on the film itself before we sort of get into other aspects of the discussion. We were able to watch the film Transcendence. Yeah, what did you think just before? I feel like talking about films, you have to like get it out, immediately. Any any immediate sort of reactions in some ways. Yeah. Any thoughts on the film? Is that okay, but with unmuting and stuff?
Yes, everything's fine. I think people can also contribute even if they haven't seen the film this time, but also previously.
Yep. No worries, Anna. Thank you. Yeah, just anyone who's seen it. I'll take us through my thoughts before we get started, but I do want to, yeah, see if you liked it or your thoughts. What I'll do then, if no one wants to take a shot at this quite odd film in some ways. I'll take us through my reading of it, I guess, and sort of what I thought was going on, or what I think might be interesting for us to talk about afterwards. So let me just share the screen. But as I said, maybe if on the chat, any sort of ideas or thoughts, or just opinions on how this film works, or if you think it is a worthy object of study for us to think about some of these ideas, even might be kind of an interesting way of starting. But let me share my screen while you're thinking. Okay. Can you see that? Yes, good. Okay. Yes, so obviously the film being titled Transcendence gives us lots of scope for thinking of what that means, right? I think one of the questions I want to ask sort of at the beginning is this question of sort of what is being transcended, and sort of, what the film seems to think is the relationship between this moment of transcendence. There's sort of seemingly a moment of transcendence that happens in the film, obviously with the sort of transcending of death that happens with Will Castor's character sort of surviving death by uploading his brain onto a computer, which then becomes a sentient AI in some sentient and sapient kind of AI, or perhaps if you want to say that. So this question is sort of quite right for us to think through, but there's also all these moments where it's kind of like, okay, but it's not about the specific moment of transcendence, because thinking has always done this. This has always been an aspect of sort of humans and human evolution. There's always this interesting sort of duality in films like this, where it's kind of, a moment of rupture, which is also justified as a rupture which defines humankind. What have we always done is this, and this is just the next moment, the next sort of rupture in a sort of continuity of sort of personhood, or the project of humanity in some sense. And you see from the beginning, it sort of like sets up these sort of like really interesting sort of binaries and distinctions between its characters. You've got the kind of, from the beginning, Will Castor, played by Johnny Depp. You've got this kind of like genius figure. I've managed to get a shot just as you can see his sort of dirty shirt, which he's putting on to sort of go to this big fancy event. Like, immediately this sort of like genius trope is used to present his character in this way of like, he can't possibly, you can't possibly be thinking about the everyday or the daily, because he's too far into ideas, etc. And obviously this is contrasted with his partner Evelyn, who's kind of, thinking through, who's sort of preparing and much more on board. You have this sort of like interesting distinction between the two characters, which is sort of actually represent, it's sort of, there's this distinction that the film makes throughout, which is kind of important and complicated, and I feel like I don't get it. Like, it starts off and there's this sense in which Evelyn is about this kind of, they make this distinction between trying to understand the world and trying to change the world. And I don't think this is some sort of like, Marxist philosophers have only tried to understand the world, the point is to change it kind of situation. There's this weird sort of dialectic between Evelyn, who changes the world, whereas Johnny Depp's character just wants to understand the world, and this sort of gets worked through in some really weird ways throughout. In some ways his character's loss of humanity, or his loss of himself, is defined by him wanting to change the world, which is, again, I don't know where that leaves us to do with the politics of the film in different ways. But this sort of like setup is important. You've then got the tech world. You've got a sneaky, cheeky little cameo by Elon Musk, which seems fairly cringeworthy now. But you've got this sort of setting within sort of like a kind of transhumanist sort of discourse within the film. I guess you could say this sense in which the film is sort of already being based on sort of specific ideological positions and understandings that obviously we understand, and sort of negotiating them through sort of new technological developments that it puts forward, all these sort of bizarre moment of like AI transcendence, you might say. Good. This is where Johnny Depp does this sort of like description, his sort of like justification. For him, this is transcendence. The creation of an AI, the singularity. He sort of calls the singularity transcendence, and that's originally what it seems to be defining, he says, what have we done but always played God? There's this sort of like, sort of transhumanist, utopian, idealistic strand to all of this going on. I did want to flag, even early on in this film, there's got these weird shots that take on a different point of view. This shot is sort of, you can see the sort of graininess of it. There's a sort of mediation going on. This is a mediated image. Most of the film is obviously sort of filmed normally or sort of invisibly, the sort of invisible editing style, invisible continuity. But there's these moments where sort of the technology that's present is put to the foreground, where the sort of the grain of the image flags something that's going on. In this case, I think the first point to say is that this is early on. It's talking about sort of mediation. This is a public talk. They're sort of, it's talking about how his image is being mediated across the world, is sending out some kind of message. But I think later on, it starts to mean something else. And that's what I want us to talk about, this sort of the cinema's vision, the sort of the way that cinema is thinking, or the point of view or the perspective that's being put forward. Because there's a few moments in this film where it's quite jarring. These switches to sort of mediated images, or sort of like the grain of the image sort of flags something sort of complicated and interesting going on to do with the circulation of information, but then also maybe even the film itself in its own point of view. You then have, for those of you who haven't seen it, I'm sort of just going to go through the plot in sort of basic ways and just flag the things I'm interested in. You have this sort of attack on their plan by sort of neo-Luddites, as they're called. The image on screen, as you said, evolution without technology. It's a sort of radical group that says, how dare you play God? And again, you see, it sets up an opposition very clearly between the sort of techno-utopian transhumanists and the sort of called neo-Luddite. It doesn't mean anything if you're not breathing, if you don't have a body. This is pain, this is horror, this is etc. I mean, interestingly, all very apolitical. This is sort of all, it's not actually thinking about sort of material conditions. It's almost sort of based on sort of more mystical notions of what is right and correct, to do with sort of like ensoulment or sort of souls and bodies. It's sort of an interestingly apolitical kind of ideological battle that's going on in the diegesis of the film, which we can think about. But the attack gets him. He is going to die. So he dies. I mean, I guess this is obviously going to be spoilers. But there's a moment then where he is uploaded onto this system that he created. And what's immediately apparent is, and what I think we should think about, is this sense in which what does it mean that this film is thinking through AI? Because it starts sort of as exploring these people who are sort of trying to build a strong AI sort of model, but they realize that they'd already done it because they'd uploaded a sort of animal consciousness, and in this case, main character's consciousness onto a computer. So it's not AI, it's something else, but it is. And it's sort of, there's a question of what that means, or why that's the case, or what the ramifications are for understanding of, how can we think more generally about sort of how might an AI think, versus what this film is trying to do, which both has a character who becomes super intelligent, and these questions are sort of, what kinds of thinking would an AI always do? And this is where the sort of text about AI drives comes in. And I think this film navigates them in a very confusing but interesting, I think, way. From the beginning, death represented through, they scatter his ashes in nature. It's sort of, a very sort of sharp distinction between sort of enclosed hospital beds, technologically mediated screens, versus this moment. There's a shot just before this of a sort of giant sort of landscape, sort of the natural world. That's where death is, whereas where not death is the sort of the city or somewhere different. So there's already these interesting sort of oppositions being set up in the very sort of nature of the film itself, or within nature. And there's a sort of important back garden that they have, which is sort of like separate from the technological world, which is sort of an overarching sort of plot point of the film. And then again, after the sort of transcendence, the singularity, this creation of Johnny Depp AI, but human, but not kind of thing. You get lots of these shots of computer vision, sort of operational images. You get these kind of you see the city just before this shot, and then it sort of, turns digital and flattens. You get the sort of the computer vision is given to us through sort of like this digitally mediated special effects, and throughout the film you get these sort of views into the sort of digital world of the AI thinking, you might say. There's also sort of the speed of it. You see the sort of typical, spatialization and sort of representation of sort of cyberspace through the sort of data collection and sort of navigation of this within the computer. So the film is very keen to give us this sort of machinic vision throughout. What then happens is that the super AI kind of wants resources. And this is obviously quite important. The AI drives is about this sort of self-replication, rationality, and resources and resource acquisition, because that will always be better for attaining one's goals, in some ways maximizing one's goals. So what this does is he buys up a plot of land in the middle of nowhere. Sort of there's no one there. I mean, there are people there, but there's no one there. And turns it into this sort of super base, for his AI contraptions. And very early on, I mean, it skips 2 years at some point from him buying up this land, making sort of, exploiting the people in the town, to then having this fully built kind of lab in different ways. And there's this moment of a switch. So that'd be interesting for us to talk about when one of his workers gets attacked for money, and he gets savagely beaten up, they say, to the point of death. And it's sort of, there's some vagaries about what that exactly means. I think here, just from the sort of the positioning of it, the way that it's filmed, there's this, and what subsequently happens, there's a sense in which he's sort of being sort of disabled by this attack, his sort of unmoving legs, for example. In this shot, he is cured, right? And this is what hopefully you've read about in the reading, this question of he's kind of cured of this disability, and he then sort of gains super strength, and he becomes an even better worker. But at the same time, his sort of like, the deal with the devil he kind of pulls in order to be cured is that he's now part of a network and can be controlled by Johnny Depp, which sounds horrible. The film itself uses this as a point because this information circulates, or there's a really telling line where it sort of says the Will-Casters kind of has let it circulate, sort of taken advantage of the circulation of this information so that lots of people then come. And again, the film really emphasizes the sort of, the sense in which the point of his character as an AI is to cure the sick, and to make them workers. Which again, I think what I hope we can talk about is the sort of representation of disability in this film and how it functions. Again, with the sort of AI CCTV camera that you see there. I mean, most prominently, in a very Jesus-like manner, he lets the blind man to see, using sort of nanotechnology, which is another sort of big moment of shift, maybe another transcendence or whatever, if you might call it that, and we can discuss it. In the film's narrative, that he's sort of curing all, and this messianic figure in some ways. And you get these interesting sort of shots of the town and the people that live there, and there's sort of this really interesting relationship between sort of, what the film is thinking about his actions, and what the film is sort of saying that he's, the sort of ethics or the morals of what he's doing, and how it all plays out. I mean, eventually they kind of, it all comes to a head, and they sort of destroy each other, essentially. Johnny Depp's character, it's complicated, but sort of falls on the sword and takes a sort of virus to kill him, and then the global communications network is destroyed. I mean, again, there's some interesting moments here where his sort of, I flagged this earlier, his intelligence is something which also then takes away from his other faculties. So he's sort of this hyper-intelligence being, and he has this argument with Evelyn, and at some point he starts saying, oh, your body is, you're sort of, pupils are dilating, your heartbeat is at this rate. And she's like, what are you talking about? He thinks he's being empathetic by sort of talking about the purely sort of scientific aspects of what the situation is, but obviously she says that that's awful and runs away angrily. So there's this sense, and this is a common trope, and we'll see it next week as well, that gaining intelligence is the loss of other faculties. The loss of empathy is part of a gaining of intelligence, which presents to us a very interesting, if very problematic model of what intelligence is, one that we can think through in relationship to sort of notions that sapience and intelligence is about kind of collective care, and that intelligence is actually about and sapience is about obligation to other people, and a social awareness isn't disentangle. You can't disentangle that from the sort of very narrow notion of the intelligent. As I said, this important moment in the film is a kind of burst of nanotechnology, and there's this moment where he kind of, intelligence becomes atmospheric in this sense. It sort of raises up and it sort of becomes a sort of atmospheric force. There's a reveal that he was going to solve climate change, but couldn't be done because everyone tried to shut him down. It gets a bit confusing at the end, to be honest, about what the film is trying to say about his actions. There's this sense in which everyone was scared of him or something, but it turned out he was going to, repair the ecosystem. But again, maybe that's something we can discuss. So this is a really interesting moment that I'll flag now, and we can come back to this. There's a sort of moment of an explosion, a sort of moment of the sort of Neo-Luddites attack their base, and there's this shot, and it lasts a sort of second. It's almost unnoticeable, where the camera is looking down on the scene, and it, as you can see on screen, there's the sort of there's the lines of sort of technological mediation come up, and this is kind of impossible. Like, there's a kind of impossibleness to why this shot is being technologically mediated. I mean, one reading of this is a kind of what Steven Shaviro in his analysis of post-cinema calls just a sort of overload of special effects, where sort of every shot can just suddenly be technologically mediated without sort of diegetic justification. But there's also a really interesting sense in which the film is about how the AI sees, and there's a sense even that there's a few times where the characters who are engaged with the AI say sort of like, I can see everything. There's this almost sense that the whole film is this sort of point of view from an AI or something like that. I'm trying to justify why these shots happen. There's not, I mean, unless I'm missing something really obvious, there's not to me an obvious sort of sense in which why this shot is then turned into a kind of CCTV or sort of surveillance shot, when it's not, to me, sort of possible. For me, I like this. Maybe it's a sort of radical misreading of it. It's almost that everything's being watched through this sort of atmospheric AI nanotechnology or something like that. And as I said, he sort of ends, and it turns out that he's sort of hidden in this one part of the world as nanotechnology, and they're together, and it's a sort of love story. It sort of opens up this sort of solving climate change, and it reverts back to a kind of being together as pools of water in a puddle that is oily and then gets fixed. It's an interesting moment. I mean, these are the readings that I put with this, and I want to hear what you think about them. I've got Pete Wolfendale's essay. I think this sort of sets up the kind of like philosophical questions going on, and the sort of point here of sort of rationalist inhumanism, what he calls this kind of unbinding of our rationality from the constraints of animality, and sort of how this might help us set up kind of how to think through sort of intelligence, especially sort of intelligence itself as something sort of artificial or inhuman within us that sort of, doesn't require us as a platform and can be spread to other kinds of platforms in different ways. I also put on the Omohundro essay, Basic AI Drives, because I don't know, there's something about sort of what Will Castor's character in Transcendence does, or what AI characters usually do, that sort of fits into this model of intelligence, the sort of the intrinsic nature of goal-driven systems, the sense that intelligence always works the same way. It's a kind of arms race, it's a winning of games, it's an acquisition of resources. And I really love this line, or love this line. There's a really interesting line that I think maybe defines quite a lot of these kind of AI super intelligence films. So AI are likely to behave like human sociopaths in their pursuit of resources. And I think that fits quite a lot of cinematic representations of the question. Then I've got to put on this Catherine Allen essay because I think, as I've already flagged, there's questions of sort of disability in this film that are really difficult. I think there's, the sort of trope of the cure is really important in this film, in really difficult and sort of problematic ways. I'll read a couple of quotes to set up what to think or what we might want to talk about. So they say that, yeah, disability study seeks to undo the moral imperative able-bodied people claim when containing and attempting to cure or rehabilitate the disabled body to normative standards. The question then becomes, as I want us to ask of the film, what does it mean to cure the disabled body, and what are the cure's outcomes, and are they desirable? And sort of on the negative side, the sense in which uncritical posthumanism promotes a transcendence that disregards the lived qualities and suffering of human bodies in the present. And then finally, this sort of more speculative and question that I want us to think through maybe at the end is what kind of thinking cinema is. And as I've tried to put forward, what kind of thinking is being done in Transcendence, because there is a sort of machinic vision that keeps on coming back to, it is a sort of surveillance mechanism. It is a sort of machinic presence itself in the film. So this is Christine Reed-Peters' work, puts forward this sort of idea that film is a non-anthropocentric form of AI, understood as the thinking performance of the cinematograph in a new realist materialist sense. So this is very ensconced in a sort of post-humanist position where sort of cinema as a form of intelligence is about, displacing what we think of as intelligence as sort of anthropocentric, and intelligence is then a sort of sense that lots of sort of other things do, including the cinema, in sort of complicated ways to do a sort of diffractive causality and sort of fields of sense in different ways, building on Epstein and Deleuze. So Repeater says that, quote, the cinematograph creates not only world involving, but world constituting relationships. It does not simply reflect reality or the world, which does not exist as an all-encompassing entity, but reconfigures the very same through thought. And I was thinking that might be useful for understanding some of these questions. I was thinking I'll stop sharing and we could take a sort of 10-minute break, just so you have a chance to maybe think about that. I've, as I said, spoken for a while, so Pradeep, what's the sort of, is it 10 to 15-minute break? What would be best, would you say?
Yeah, it's usually 10 minutes. We also have some comments regarding
Yes.
the movie, so the film, and we can pick that up as well.
Yes, good. Okay, good. So 10 minutes. Thank you so much for listening to the opening spiel. I look forward to discussing all of this, in 10 minutes. So I'll see you at sort of just before quarter past, and I'll go through the comments. So I didn't see them before. Thank you so much. Yeah, see you in 10 or so
Yeah,
minutes. Thanks.
thank you, everyone.
Hi. Should we get started again? Is everyone back? Could you do a thing in the chat or say hi if you're back? Hi. And yeah. We'll do proper introductions and everything next week, for as is the sort of format. Good. Yeah. So, and if you can turn your cameras on, that would be amazing, but obviously no pressure to do so. Before we get into the discussion, I did want to just quickly, I forgot to flag earlier, the sort of the sort of assessments of the unit. Let me just share the slides. As you know, there's two sort of units, a sort of presentation aspect and then a final essay. What I'm thinking for these is sort of quite simple, quite sort of broad tasks. The first being the sort of presentation, ideally in groups, but I know that that's not always possible, where you sort of just simply kind of pick a reading from the week that you choose, and then pick a scene from the film of that week and sort of see how they might go together or what might be interesting. I mean, some of the readings, for example, especially in the third week, are about the film. So, you know, to sort of pick even the scene that it's talking about and explain what it's doing and sort of how it's working, and in groups sort of working out what's interesting. And again, this sort of question that we're thinking about in the whole unit, you know, how is it negotiating these different kinds of forms of thought, and how is it doing it cinematically in some way, that sort of film studies kind of perspective as well. That's a recorded presentation, sort of 10 to 15 minutes long. I mean, ideally to be put up before the session so we can talk about it, but I know that that's not always possible, so it's up to you as well. But that could be good if you were able to do so. That would be interesting. I know that the groups will be sorted out after the session if that's all correct. And then the final essay question, sort of 2,000 words of just, again, very broad, and for everybody who's sort of starting to, as soon as you sort of start to think of ideas, you know, to contact me and we can sort of start talking about what it might mean, is to pick a film sort of not from this that we're screening, and to examine how it negotiates aspects of intelligence, sort of, you know, what kinds of thinking does it present. There's already been in the chat, I was reading the comments in the break, you know, devs, Alex Garland's devs, you know, how would that be? I say a film, I film or TV show, or media in general. Actually, I should be more broad in my scope there, I think. So hopefully that's clear. If it's not, just let me know and we can talk about it. And yeah, I'm hoping that will be interesting for you to, you know, one, I'm sort of selfishly excited to see, you know, what kinds of films you choose, what films do you think are interesting for these questions as sort of presentations of technology, but also not even necessarily technologically based, you know, what kinds of different kinds of thinking, you know, what kinds of like non-human or sort of superhuman or sort of expanded human, or even just sort of like human but extreme perhaps forms of thinking can be presented. But again, you can take it very broad. You know, you could even look at, you know, moral intelligence within like a Haneke film or something, I'm guessing, or sort of the morality of a Yorgos Lanthimos film or something like that. It is to be thought as widely and as broadly as possible, I would say. So as I said, any questions about that, I'd be very, you know, ready to discuss that with everybody. I'm looking forward to seeing what you'll be thinking about. Lost my screen. Good. I see there's already comments on the chat, but I wondered if anybody who was commenting might want to, yeah, open it up for discussion, and I'd love to hear what you thought of the ideas in the films, etc. Yes, Katerina, please just speak. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't speak before. That's why I wrote a few comments. I mean, there are a lot of nuances in the film, obviously. So there are a lot of things to talk about. I've written a few notes whilst we were having a break. So first of all, the idea that you know, technological development and the development of a super intelligent machine that people cannot comprehend, and the idea that this will mark the end of humanity. So, for example, in the film, that even his colleague, his long-time colleague Max, is not able to comprehend what is happening, and there are trust issues involved, and people are worried that the machine is going to colonize everything and extinguish basically every sort of organic life. You see like the AIs, which is like omnipresent, and its ability to access like a very big number of information and sources by the time it's like logged into the system. So we see that it's already like, this demonstrates that it's already like superior to humans, and this poses like a threat to humanity itself. So one reason even for his wife to be skeptical about the intentions of her husband. Then this leads to him becoming like a godly status. That's why I raised in the comments like the theological concern. You see that usually in the AI films, like for example, Hair by Spike Jonze, you don't see like these people carrying or being like manifested as AI machines. They don't carry like a mortal body, like a corporeal body. So that already makes them taking like a godly-like status, which is like something that's not very imaginable for us humans. And then like more smaller nuances like issues of privacy, especially in the end of the film where you see Evelyn, she's being measured by her heart palpitations, and you see the whole info of her in the screen, and she was raising some concerns like, okay, this is not good. I don't know exactly what she said, but she didn't like it, that Will supposedly knows everything about herself, even her emotions and what she's thinking right now. So of course, like huge privacy concerns, and then also like ecological ones, I guess. Like what happens if you just leave basically the whole world over one AI machine that supposedly has good intentions, but you just don't know for how long. So that's my take about the film.
Great, Katerina, thank you so much. No, I completely agree. There's some really interesting stuff that kind of, it's like right at the beginning when the sort of moment happens, the sort of, the sort of very cliche kind of about to press the button to turn off the system because it's not working, and at that second it's sort of like, is anyone there? And it's sort of the sort of that sort of very suspense laden moment that might not have required such. And then as soon as it happens, I think the first thing Will Castor, Johnny Depp's character, said is like, hook me up to the financial system. And as soon as that, his friend Max is like, no, that's not him. So there's an instinct, that sort of question of like the end of humanity is like such a interesting question, because it forces us to ask, well, what do you mean? Like so what's humanity? Because there's the sort of value judgment of like the humane and humanity, that's not humane because it's not him, it's not his personality. That's not humane because it's not good. Is often, to be humane is like is a value judgment in that sense. But indeed his whole thing is that, I really like that stuff about the sort of godlike aspects, and that sort of the messianic curing, making the blind man see, very, very on the nose, kind of like religious imagery on the film. There's a bit at the beginning when he says something like, isn't that what man has always done, tried to create God or tried to do that. So again, there's a sense of a sort of end of humanity against the notion of sort of the continuation of some kind of human project through transcendence, or the transcendence is the sort of the cornerstone of thinking or intelligence or humans, right? And this is just the next step in such. So that the rupture versus a kind of continuity is really interesting.
Also, there was something very interesting in the beginning of the film where there were like both of them in this conference, and I kind of took a screenshot of one particular frame that it was, I think it was Will or his wife, I don't remember, that he was asking where does the soul reside. So I think it's like also a question that you see it like being repeated throughout the film, not necessarily in a very obvious sense, but also when they were like interacting with the AI machine before Will becomes one. The first question they were posing was like, "Are you self-aware?"
Yeah.
And this is the question that he also got from his colleagues when his wife first introduced him to them. Like, "Are you self-aware?" And he was making like a little joke about it. So yeah, again, the idea like like AI machines are capable of emotions, and to what extent are these also like part of an algorithmic process, or are they actually real? Is it like will, or is it just like a mock-up of will?
Yeah, no, and I think that's sort of the question that's so like, yeah, I don't even know to say if it's resolved, that question of sort of like, was it him? And you know, there's some sort of amazingly bizarre lines, like because Cillian Murphy's in it as the police officer, Buchanan, I think his name is, and at one point he sort of, you know, for some reason said, "Oh, it's not him because he doesn't really love her." So there's this sort of like association of him and humanity and love, and that sort of opposition that's set up. I think I made a note of some lines to do with like, you know, humans are to do with illogical contradictions. You know, that's what humanity is about, not this sort of difference to that. Yeah, that moment's really interesting, the one you said. So for those of you who haven't seen it, there's this moment early on where there's a sort of prototype for the AI called Hin, which is, I think, the uploaded consciousness of a monkey, who then and then there's a weird moment where sort of they realize that was AI all along, in a sort of slightly odd sense. And then, but Morgan Freeman's character says, "Are you self-aware?" And the response is, "I don't know, are you?" And then later on, they ask, well, Castor's AI, you know, character, the same question, and his response is a sort of self-aware joke, a reference back. So that's sort of almost, I don't know, I felt that is sort of almost suggesting that is that like proving he is himself, or proving that he is self-conscious because he's able to make a joke about it. I mean, for those of, I'm sure as lots of you have played with ChatGPT, not that that counts as, I mean, that's just a large language model, obviously, but I mean, it's good at doing jokes. I mean, I'm not saying it's funny, but it's sort of, those sort of quips are sort of like cliched aspects of that sort of like, you know, are you self-aware? Oh, I don't know. Are you? Is something's quite interesting. I mean, just as a sort of personal aside, because I spent the last sort of month marking undergraduate student essays, where the sort of use of AI the use of ChatGPT has sort of exploded in literally the last few months. It's really obvious. It's like terrifyingly obvious when there's a sort of, I mean, again, not to equate ChatGPT and Castor and Transcendence, because that'd be nuts. But there's this like, it's so obvious when you're reading an essay that's not saying anything, that's sort of fluffy and just sort of like circling around issues. So it's interesting. I don't know, I just found that really interesting, that sort of sense in which it was that little joke that was trying to do something, was trying to sort of say something about who he was or what his kind of intelligence was itself in some ways. And I thought, yeah, there's loads of other points you brought up that were really interesting, Katrina, that kind of like Katrina, sorry, that kind of like question of privacy, surveillance. The thing that I kept on thinking was Evelyn, every time Evelyn woke up, he was just there. And it wasn't quite even commented on, but it was just because he didn't sleep. So he was just sort of always sort of sitting around watching, and it was almost part of the ambient stress of the film that I was sort of thinking, they're gonna say how weird and creepy this whole thing is? It's sort of quite bizarre. But it comes into these questions then of surveillance and sort of the use of surveillance footage that happens quite a lot of the film. It's often shown him looking, or at least it's sort of suggested that he's looking, or that you're suddenly getting shots from surveillance cameras, or you're getting shots, as I've said, that are sort of mediated through the sort of the mediation of the technology on the sort of like quality of the image, and that question of sort of surveillance is really interesting. I mean, one of the first moments where that use of sort of, I think actually the moment I showed, you know, when it's sort of gliding through the sort of like hyperlinked cyberspace, was precisely a surveillance exercise in sort of finding the sort of terrorists. And, you know, he could just find them immediately because he sort of sees everything. So I think that's a really important point. Yeah. Anyone? Yeah, and anyone else, or Kudin, what do you think of that kind of idea? That moment is really odd. The sort of self-aware joke. I thought it was quite interesting.
I don't know. It also made me very confused because it's exactly what you said. Is it like programmed to basically reply as such that, like with a joke or with this particular response, or is it actually Will's sense of humor?
Yeah.
Even before the actual end, it was very confusing because you would see like his wife going through this like emotional turmoil and questioning the whole thing, and even like Will, whether it's Will or not. I'm not sure about the actual end. I don't want to comment on that because I think it's like kind of open for interpretations.
Yeah. No, I think so as well. There is a sort of weird moment where, the sort of perspective that they were all just under some illusion, and this was sort of just a sort of like, an AI totally separate from the true real being that was Johnny Depp's character, is sort of actually it turns out that he was him and that he was doing this amazing thing and trying to like change the world. And I don't really know this. The ending's bizarre, especially because global networks fail and everything seems kind of chill. Like it's that would do havoc to the world. It would immediately cause sort of riots and mayhem and everyone's just chilling about in gardens and like living some sort of weird anarchist dream. I don't even like trying to comment on what the sort of this relationship between confusing and like confused is something I keep on coming back to. Like when we're trying to understand an ending like this, that sort of on what level is it making sense? Is it making sense on a sort of dramatic level of sort of resolution, but on that sort of conceptual level, is it able to sort of bring together these quite bizarre notions? Is it confusing because it's open-ended, or is it just confused and we should just not think about this as useful for our understandings of intelligence or something like that? But that notion of sort of intelligence is sort of, because even in films where the person stays the same, it's less sort of like AI upload. That notion that gaining intelligence, and we'll see this next week, means becoming something different anyway, and losing faculties, which seems bizarre to gain intelligence by losing other faculties. It's almost that cinema can only, cinema in general, but there's a sense in which intelligence can only be presented as a sort of focusing or a sort of like shedding of empathy or sort of care, or the social is one of the really difficult and dangerous aspects. Yes, there is a point in the comments. Elaine, do you want to expand, or should I read out your point?
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, it was interesting seeing it as a Blade Runner comparison, just obviously where relationships form after AI exists. So you kind of become embroiled in this after the fact, and actually that feels less intrusive. Here maybe the issue is not so much, or like the fear feels actually less to do with mass control and more to do with, oh God, am I kind of a euthanasia question? Like, do I want to put this person to sleep for good, or do I have to listen to them for the rest of for the rest of my life? I just say this because I'm not trying to read it through love the way Hollywood teaches us to. Feels easier to do than anything else.
And it's obviously something that's sort of the film ends on. I think the last line is like they're together or something. Something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That sort of, I hadn't thought of it related to that. I'm doing edits on a chapter about sort of Blade Runner and Her, actually Blade Runner 2049 and Her, precisely to do with this question of sort of like AI sex scenes and sort of how they kind of negotiate questions of emotion, but also questions of sort of care, or sort of questions of sort of judgment and sort of moralistic judgment against sort of like questions of love with sort of non-human AI characters, sort of moralistic in some sense. But this, I think that's such a great comparison, the sense in which that it being a weird measurement the whole time of the film of humanity, that being the sort of link back. I mean, in that is in the sense how the film is sort of negotiating intelligence by sort of having this character have a link back to a comparison point, so you can sort of compare before and after in some ways through how it's presenting love, if Elaine, if that's what you were sort of thinking in some ways. And again, the sort of fear of, I love that, leads to a fear of us becoming enslaved online, existing with ourselves forever. Because I mean, one of the things I was thinking is the sense in which transcendence in the end means transcendence from death, right? I mean, that's the sort of, that's the moment, is that he's not going to die anymore. I mean, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also like a very Christian idea, right? Of like beginning on the back foot, like, you guys have already fucked up once, so you better be good this time. And then the idea of transcendence obviously being that, you know, you have something to elevate from, some depths, you exist on some kind of lower plane. So it's like almost not transcendence at the same time. And obviously that's what the film's kind of grappling with as well. How that balances with love, which is fun.
Yeah, no, good. Yeah, does anyone else want to come in on those kinds of questions, how it's sort of you know, what that means for understanding of its use of AI, and especially that sense in which, because I'm trying to think what's the difference between this and other films where AI is a sort of separate thinking, like it's sort of like an AI is created and that thinks in a different way, or usually it thinks as we do. I mean, often I think the notion of sort of, the fear of AI is also the sort of fear of colonization, the sort of sense in which science fiction films often, especially sort of Western science fiction films, envision the future of aliens and AI, and what they do is they look back and sort of assume that AI will do what Western countries did across the world in colonization. It's sort of weird, sort of like almost like lack of imagination across, to sort of think aliens and AI will repeat the history, the horrors of sort of European colonization. But this sense in which it kind of not having a sort of autonomous separate AI, but having this bizarre sort of narrative trick where it's, oh, actually AI, we've already got it. You can just make a person an AI. I mean, is it just pointless?
I mean, that you're making me think of these kind of really classic kind of tropes of 2001: A Space Odyssey or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? It's like the body gets displaced, and that's kind of a primal kind of fear trigger. And it also reminds me, through this whole conversation, I don't know if it's tangential or not, but it reminds me of kind of a William Gibson quote, where he says, we are already technology if you're over 40 and have teeth in your head, right? So that also gets into this uncanny valley, in reverse of like, well, it has already happened,
Yeah. I mean, and I think that, come back to that sort of transcendence as rupture, or this sort of singularity as rupture, versus the sort of placing, and we'll see this so hard next week with Lucy, which does this in like some pretty totally nuts ways, but like the sort of placing of sort of transcendence to artificiality, or sort of moments of artificiality, as in a much longer train of tool use or language use. Language being an artificial mechanism, tool use being sort of like that intelligence itself already being an artificial aspect of, or even sort of, obviously rupturing what the artificial means in the first place to make some kind of philosophical point, right? But that sort of form of artificiality is already within us, and that thing is called reason, and reason is what allows us to sort of transcend in some ways, or to sort of to alienate ourselves from the natural world in some form. And that's sort of a really important part of, you know, xenofeminism, Laboria Cubonics, that sort of sense of the alienation that sort of thinking always does. It's always that sort of ability to sort of rise out in complicated, not sort of, to make it too simplistic would be dangerous, right? But to sort of to extricate oneself from a state of affairs or something like that. So that sort of sense of a sort of, not always, but historically quite constant aspect of that sort of move to the artificial. When I'm thinking of sort of philosophies of technology like Leroy Gorman, or sort of, was it David Willis talks about the back as a technology, dorsality. So there's limbs as sort of technology, and I think it sort of helps, you know, shift, you know, how we might think about those. But I mean, the film's very keen to sort of say, here's the natural world and here's death, here's you know, interestingly a sort of desert, which is interesting, but a sort of a technologically built up environment and the sort of artificial. That question of sort of body displaced is really interesting, because it does in this film have sort of mind control in some confusing way, where these bodies are sort of taken over by nanotechnology and sort of like puppeted. One of the things that, again, it's sort of, so one of the other sort of bits that Evelyn sort of thinks this is awful is when, you know, Will Castor's character, or Will Castor, keeps on taking over the bodies of co-workers and talking to her. And isn't that obvious that would be creepy? Like, you know, he's supposed to be this like mad intelligent AI, and he can't work out that just someone around the base suddenly saying, hey, how's it going, is not going to be really weird and creepy. I'm always sort of amazed at the sort of stupidity of intelligence that trucks within sort of like films like this. Yeah. What do people think?
Yeah, maybe I can jump on, because that part also stood out to me, because it's kind of like the point at which Evelyn, I think, like kind of betrays Will, or like decides to, like, from what I remember at least, like it's like that kind of moment where she realizes like that she's kind of, what she feels kind of morally conflicted, and then kind of agrees to like go along with this like virus plan. But I think like, yeah, somehow, I mean, it's kind of like the political like position is kind of like positive at the end for me. It's like actually not so open, but it seems like in a way, like the kind of the very concept of singularity is kind of like the kind of like battleground of the film. Somehow, like you have like the kind of singular body, or like the incarnated body of individual people, which is kind of like respected and somehow like almost like sacred, or something, or shouldn't be transgressed. There's some kind of limit, like the incarnate kind of body. But then there's also like the singularity as like this kind of futuristic concept of like diffuse singularity, wherein like the line between one's body and another is not really important. And it seems like the film like somehow is trying to like Evelyn kind of being freaked out about that kind of leads her to, yeah, kind of take the kind of formless side, the side of like the kind of body being, the incarnate body being like somehow like something you cannot kind of transgress, even in the name of like progress. But in the end, like it's actually like it's kind of positive. It's as if she was able to kind of go over this, then she could have saved the world, because like Will in the super intelligent computer was going to kind of like I guess like amend the ills of climate change or whatever. So it's quite like kind of interesting perspective, because like they're kind of like radically opposite, but they're both kind of like apolitical, as you said. Like they're both kind of abandoning like the role of the subject. And somehow like one is like, you just need to like, what is this thing? Like I didn't even notice it until you brought up the slide, but like evolution without technology. So evolution being this kind of like, you know, like this thing that just happens, whatever. And then it's like it's pure technology. Again, like so they're both like very deterministic, weirdly, even though, you know what I mean? Like I feel like it takes the kind of accelerationist view, but it also like somehow like the film, like I mean I didn't really think of it until you kind of articulated these terms already, but like it kind of like dances around like the very like problematics of this like the post-humanist kind of stuff to me. You know what I mean? Like it really like speaks to it somehow. Anyway, this went a bit of a tangent there, but I think like, yeah, this kind of like ultimate horror of like a body being controlled kind of somehow like almost being posited something like we need to get over, or like like, yeah, like do the ends justify the means kind of thing. I don't know.
No, I think that's really, really interesting because that was the thing I was really thinking. What is the point? There's like a point of a switch where he like, yeah, as you said, like there's a moral boundary crossed. And it's to do with that moment where his coworker gets sort of disabled, I think, is the sort of suggestion. He gets sort of savagely beaten up, and there's a sense that it's the only way to rebuild him through the sort of nanotechnology is also then to like control his body. And I think I'm really interested in that, what you said about what is the moral point? Like what is the sort of the moral rupture, that sense of like the body being transgressed or the body being sort of like interfered with in some ways. Because I was relating it to reading about disability studies and science fiction, because it's sort of, in some ways it's in some ways I feel like the film is saying, oh, it's great he's curing, but it's bad he's controlling. And I can't quite, and I don't know if that's because I think as the sort of, disability studies is really, what it does is sort of pinpoint how the cure as a trope within science fiction assumes what disability is, assumes that it only exists as difference there's a really great line here, disability only exists as difference which has to be corrected, right? So because part of me was thinking, was the point at which he's sort of interfering with where he's curing making the blind man see and sort of letting people walk again, is that because that's Jesus things in some ways, but it's also kind of, I'm getting lost in it because I don't quite know what is that moral point that gets wrong. I feel like it is falling into the worst tropes of the science fiction cure narrative. Because in the end, obviously, one, they make him superhuman. Two, he's curing them to make them exploitable as workers, right? It's, that's the point then, like, oh, finally you can be useful to my project, which then isn't quite defined. Yeah, how did people find that kind of representation of disability? And because it does, in a confusing way, also mark the point of a moral rupture in the film where a step is gone too far, and that question of what was it, the innate body being sacred, I think, is in conflict with potentially the sense in which the film is saying we can transcend the body and we can get rid of, and we can sort of solve, what it's calling or what it's assuming to be a problem, which we can critique from a sort of disability studies perspective as the sort of social creation of disability. They're disabled because they are, this is a land where no one lives, right? And so people need work and they're being sort of like forced to be exploited, but they're being given this cure, and it's all very complicated and odd. I don't know what you, Nick, I don't know how that factored in, that kind of disability studies point to that maybe.
Yeah, I guess like to me, of course, this like the kind of normative like aspect of like, the film is ideological and it kind of like just assumes that people, there's a kind of normal body that we should all aspire to or whatever. But also, I guess like the context and being kind of this kind of, I just kind of assumed it was this like rundown kind of Rust Belt American town where you already have the kind of opioid epidemic and people out of work and this kind of like and also like kind of big, I guess it's like quite, what I understand, like Christianity is quite kind of dominant like worldview or like way of kind of understanding the world in those parts of America. So I feel like it kind of was quite on the nose in that sense somehow. But yeah, kind of disability, but that's fun. That's a social problem in a way. Like the opioid epidemic is like socially created, etc. And so are the injuries that people like kind of sustained working in factories or mines or whatever before that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of completely disavowed in the film. It's just kind of there. But I guess just on like the first, kind of just going back to this like kind of the sacredness of the body or whatever, and like not transgressing anyone's body. It's kind of like okay. On the one hand, it's like okay for him to like fix bodies, but it's not okay for him to inhabit it. So like in a way, it's like the only like kind of Will's downfall or like Will DAI whatever's downfall is when it's somehow like when he puts his own particular interests in front of like the kind of collective somehow, it seems, which I guess is like you know, like when he kind of takes off his body so specifically he can talk to Evelyn, it's like somehow showing that like despite the supposedly like universal thing, kind of machine apparatus, whatever, kind of being created, somehow like Will's own. It's like a human fault. There's something like very anti-human about the whole film, basically. You know, I think like in a way, and like that kind of it's almost like because there's a bit of human left in the machine, and because that bit of human kind of naturally, or you know, for whatever personal reasons, wants to like communicate with Evelyn. That's what like causes this whole like the whole kind of universalist plan of fixing climate change to never really like happen. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, this is a very weird and contradictory film, I think, because that sense of the sacred is interesting because there's points where it seems like I think you're really right that the line that's being crossed is a sort of quite mystical one. You know, I feel like there's one line where Kate Mara's character suddenly says sort of, this is awful, this AI has never breathed, there's never, and it's like there's almost like this sort of like mystical sense of like what real humanity is, and that moment where it's sort of especially good, it interacts with the sort of like dematerialization of AI as sort of like disembodied voices that Katerina was talking about. Another moment of rupture is him making his own body, and that's worse. That's like the moment where it's like you're playing God by making a body. I don't why, like that's an interestingly odd moment for it to get weird for her. I mean, the question I had is sort of one that I like, that question of sort of personal interests and sort of like what the goal. I mean, one of the questions we should ask is what is actually the goal of the AI, and we've got the Alejandro kind of like drives essay to sort of think through, or maybe to help us do so, right? But like it's narrativized in this interestingly sort of like almost like haphazard way where by chance this co-worker is beaten up, and then well, we can fix him, and then now we can make him super powerful, and then that thing goes viral, that video of him being super strength, and then sort of people from around town come and get cured. But did it really require that accident for that to happen? It seems like quite odd that sort of if he was sort of, you know, as Alejandro talks about psychopathic kind of drives or whatever, if he was sort of like to do with resource acquisition and to do with like work, he would have made them all super strength already. Like, why did an accident create that moment? Like it was interesting that and again, you know, we can sort of say it's just nonsensical, but I feel like the film having to justify that action through sort of like chance tells us something about what it's afraid to do, which is perhaps to say he went to that place because he knew that there would be poor people he could exploit. He went to that place perhaps because he knew people would be disabled, and that he would sort of offer a cure and then sort of become this sort of messianic figure that sort of made exploitable workers. I don't know what even question that this is. Are we sort of saying that, you know, are there just two ways of reading it? I mean, that's what's often so incredible about, I'm thinking of sort of Ex Machina, right, where you get to the end and there's one reading of the film which is, you know, there was a self-consciousness, there was a humanity in the film's terms that was deciding what was happening. It was to do with personality, it was to do with emotions in some sense. And then there's this under reading, this sort of like, it's this other reading, which is, you know, everything is meticulous and psychopathic. And that weird sort of excuse, which is, there's an accident and I just happened at that point to think that I can cure this person, as opposed to that was always the plan, and this just created a sort of excuse. Because there's this really interesting line where Evelyn Will Caster says, and look, this has gone viral, so people have come, and she says, you let go viral. Like, even then it was like no, why are you telling me something that isn't true? You meant to do this. There's a sort of maliciousness, not maliciousness, but there's a calculating aspect that is being masked through chance and whatever. I don't even quite know how to figure that bit out. I don't know. Yeah. Anyone had any thoughts? I mean, what does he want? We got a question. We got a point. Elaine, do you want to elaborate, or should I?
I was just going to say, just on the point of trying to create these superhuman workers who you know were I think in City of Quartz, Mike Davis talks about how that was basically how California was founded. They just kept trying to attract people to come to California because of how weak the labor laws were and how the sun could cure you of any ailments. And you had all of these sick people trundling along to California and then discovering that the sun actually didn't cure you of anything. But then, you know, it's a kind of, and then after that, obviously, you have like the education, and then you have Hollywood, which sprung up. But all of these things, like wild promises of success or some kind of salvation. And yeah, I wouldn't put it past them, Hollywood, not to make another film about Hollywood, even using AI as a backdrop. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, I love thinking about, yeah, because yeah, the move from Hollywood, right? The move to Hollywood was precisely about like light and labor laws and and how much one could exploit. So that's baked in. And yeah, that sense in which this film, you know, why they go there is precisely to do with sort of, and probably to do with questions of light and exploitation in some similar ways. That's a really, really good point. But it's just interesting to sort of try and think how one, what do we interpret as his motives? Two, how does the film sort of cover itself or sort of present these motives to us in different ways? Because it is, yeah, I mean, I mean, do we believe that he was going to solve climate change? I guess is the question. Oh, because Nick, you said about personal interest. And again, like again, part of me is sort of thinking there's no personal interest. He needs to keep Evelyn on side because she's the one aiding and abetting his plans. Like it's just like again, like there's something always interesting in this sort of like kind of films where there is a reading where it's all pure, again, rationality. I mean, you know, I think one of the things that we can flag at the beginning, and it comes up in sort of the Omohundro essay a bit, the sense in which there's going to be a difference in our discussions around sort of rational choices and actions and a sort of sapience, or sort of, you know, for example, you know, you can do things very rationally but have a very irrational goal. You know, you can do things according to a sort of like, you know, you can, you know, especially Omohundro's talking about like game theory, right? You can sort of game it, and you're trying to win, but it doesn't mean your goals are sort of rational. So that relationship between sort of overarching sort of rationality and not, and sapience is some attempt to sort of try and understand, in order for intelligence to happen, there are obligations that define a much wider sort of like reach of it, right? Which is to do with creations of community or something. So there's a rub up between those two. But yeah, I don't know. Anyone else want to comment on the on his motives? Did they really miss the chance to save the whole world because they got a bit weirded out that the sacred nature of the body was being disrupted? Which again, I think is different for the question of disability studies and worker exploitation, but complicatedly interlinked in some ways. Yeah. Got a point, Catherine. Definitely a lot of do you want to comment on this? Definitely a lot of ethical concerns. He took a lot of questionable actions. What did he do wrong? Not not yeah, what did he do
I
wrong?
mean, I can't really self right from wrong, but he took a lot of questionable actions. Like in the end, you saw him showing to Evelyn that he created life, itself. Like you saw the, I don't know if you noticed, like a hand, like this figure of a hand, like inside a box. And the idea that he was basically sort of like, recruiting a whole army, like a replica of himself appearing here and there and trying to defend the whole structure. Also, like his past colleagues visiting the establishment and giving this like post-it note to Evelyn, like just run out of this place. It was kind of, terrifying, because you were indeed, that moment when you were watching the film, you were also like questioning his actions, like what is the purpose of them all, and no matter how well his intentions are, he's still like, an AI machine trying to occupy the whole world. So I don't know how, if that makes sense.
Well, this is this question of sort of, yeah, the Omohundro essay, which is that sort of AI drives that sense in which that definition of intelligence or sort of AI will necessarily have to do certain things. It's almost like transcendental conditions of an intelligence, which is self-replication, which is resource acquisition.
And also, like, sorry for interrupting you, but also like depriving humans of their own agency and basically their own identity, like taking their agency. They don't have any initiative, basically, they just follow along. So this is also like a very big ethical concern.
Absolutely. And even if, and there's this, I hadn't thought of it until what you were just saying, there's almost like a sort of eco-fascist kind of underlying, where it's like, I mean, it definitely, in order to solve climate change, I need to sort of make everybody myself and sort of the aspects of control, aspects of sort of the only way to solve it is through this sort of like super high-powered AI thing or something like that. Is something that comes to mind when I'm thinking about that. I mean, there's definitely this sort of interesting sort of, I mean, we've said it before, but there's this very much a sort of disavowal of like real politics. Obviously, I mean, I'm not saying it has to, but it's interesting how, I mean, one of the questions I wanted to ask was about sort of the moment the AI goes atmospheric, because, especially when we want to think about the sort of material and the materiality, there's this sense in which, the desire being, indexed here is sort of for humans or human-like things to sort of have atmospheric forces, or like to be an atmospheric force, because it becomes sort of in the air, in the water. It's going to solve all dirty water problems. It's going to change the climate. Of course, there's no tackling like, anything, the actual politics of what's going on, in some ways sort of inequalities and how that affects sort of like, climate. It's sort of this sort of bizarre sort of techno solutionism, that if only we can sort of, and I guess the thing that I'm confused about that I can't quite articulate is the relationship between, the materiality and the sort of dematerialization that comes with sort of intelligence and AI, and the sort of digital, the relationship between, because the digital becomes a sort of materiality, as well as the sort of nanotechnology, as well as the sort of like, I don't know, it feels like this might just be the wrong way of thinking about it. It's almost like it's not transcending, it's becoming immanent to the world. That's what like the evolution of the AI is. It becomes immanent to material. And so we actually, well, I think I'm just misusing those words, or sort of like using them too openly. But yeah, how do people find atmospheric Johnny Depp? do put things in the chat if you want to write something, but not have to. I won't pick everybody out who writes something if you just want to type something as well. I mean, there's one thing I always think is that, I mean, there's a question, because I want to also think about like cinema and sort of like what cinema can do, because there's often this sense in which how can cinema represent thinking, and I think that sense in which, and special effects and spectacle are part of this. One of the things that's quite interesting is how does one make a spectacle out of the intelligence, when in some ways the sort of disembodied or sort of like dematerialized aspects of intelligence means that stuff would just happen without visuals or something. Like cinema does have to root it back in the material because it wants spectacle. Again, I'm saying cinema does this, which is quite, that's a shorthand, I guess, for these kinds of films, this kind of genre, these kinds of forms. The material, again, I think it's a bit cheap to just say this is to do with spectacle and we don't have to worry about the ideological connotations or the sort of like philosophical ramifications of it, but understanding how cinema is able to envision thought and intelligence and its elevation or transcendence, or as I tried to say, becoming imminent, is through sort of special effects, and that nanotechnology is quite an interesting aspect to it. Again, I just find that sort of atmospheric force, a sort of desire. I mean, we're also trying to see how sort of specific desires are being sort of represented. What did people think of those images that I put up about where that image specifically? I just want to put it up again because I think it's really weird. I kind of didn't quite get what was going on. Let me just get it up. Where the image suddenly becomes, I mean, I might just be totally misreading it, but it seems bizarre. And there's a few moments that's similar, where the image sort of turns into a surveillance footage. I mean, yeah, my sort of big take was that every time, Johnny, Castor kind of says it, and Evelyn says it when she gets plugged in at the end, or whatever you want to call it. Says something she says something like, I can see everything. And there's something about this shot that made me think, are we seeing everything through the AI omniscience or something? That I don't know if that's a useful take or a sort of, it's just, this shot was so short and so weird, unless I'm just missing the sort of logistics of it and it's just a CCTV camera. It seems like there's a camera in nowhere because Johnny Depp can see everyone. Does anyone buy that? Or think it's interesting or useful, rather?
I guess I can't help but to, I mean, I can't help but to think of, I mean, this idea of like, technology and I can see everything is like, it just immediately evokes, the Donna Haraway God trick, right? I mean, it's like, it makes me think of the critique of the God trick and the extension of technology of ways of seeing. And so I don't know, that just rings a bell for me there.
No, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. Like I think that I mean the film's comes very self-consciously trying to position him as like godlike. I mean, I love that it's still, if it's true that this is sort of like AI God trick, like AI sort of like God vision, that it's still got like imperfections of the image. That somehow it's still like glitches or sort of the material is still there, even if it's sort of a God trick. It's sort of
right, but then it raises these other questions. I mean, again, I'm just speculating here, riffing. It's just like, is there then like a collapse of like, well, that's all inclusive as well? And this notion of the atmospheric also makes me think of like, Kathleen Stewart, Ordinary Affects, where it's just like these mundane things then become our spectacle in a kind of a non-spectacular way because they're so pervasive. Or Stewart's kind of colleague, Susan Lepselter, who kind of writes about these realm, what we believe that then is there's no it's not a question of like you know, is this real or what is this? It just is.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you
So
think?
it's, I mean, I don't know if this is like some, you know, kind of, you know, armchair singularity stuff. You know, I don't know.
No. I think it's really interesting. I want, yeah. How do you think it sort of plays out? Do you think, how would it play out to how this is sort of thinking about the atmospheric? I mean, for me, the sort of almost the atmospheric here is, I'm always trying to say it's like the disavowal of politics, because it's sort of, it's I don't know, it's sort of, it's trying to escape. No, I honestly don't know. There's something really bizarre going on with this sort of moment where it's sort of the solution is the sort of like becoming everyone and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That, because if the atmospheric is like omnipresent in everything and everyone, and we are of it, not in it, right? Then there's a bit of a right. It becomes kind of an apolitical, non like fait accompli or something, right?
Yeah. I mean, and this does come up again. I don't want to ruin Lucy if you haven't seen it, but there's similar kind of like I am everywhere kind of stuff. And that relationship between the sort of you know, the biological, the technical, dissolving in all these different ways. It seems like there's a sort of, the transcendence is also a kind of, not transcendence out of nature, it's transcendence as one of to become a natural force, right? Which sort of which doesn't have to reckon with, you know, it's a fantasy because it doesn't have to reckon with our human kind of tension with the environment, because we just become one, right? In some way. So there's no tension there. There's no sort of like, how does one deal with the atmosphere? How does one sort of like,
right? There's no critical distance.
Yeah. It's sort of just pure. Yeah, it's sort of like bizarrely imminent. is the fantasy, right? I have a question. Elaine, do you want to come in? Was it Minority Report-esque, but instead of trying to, oh, there's another one. So, Minority Report-esque, but instead of trying to save individual humans, he's trying to save the planet by killing people. Yes. Although actually, there's that interesting line that they make a big deal out of, which I feel like I misunderstood, where he sort of right at the end, it's he suddenly says, "Oh, he didn't kill anyone." They make a big deal out of like, "Oh, we were wrong the whole time" or something. I mean, I don't want to get too much into sort of like evaluation, but the film jumps lots. Like the pace is like really interesting. It sort of suddenly will sort of jump to a new section. It feels like it could probably be like twice as long and sort of have those bits, but it kind of, there's a sort of suggestion at the end that like maybe he wasn't the bad guy all along, or some weird sort of like move. Elaine, I don't know if you want to come in on that at all.
Yeah, there is, I don't know, I felt like the conspiracy theory that you were getting at earlier was like almost the AI's taken over the film and they're like, fuck, we need to improve our rep, like let's just make it about like protecting the planet. And then I felt, was I wrong? Was that kind of the conspiracy theory you were hinting earlier?
No, I didn't. That's better than what I was thinking.
Okay.
That's really good. I was sort of just thinking, I was sort of thinking that sense in which it's playing with different kinds of vision, and I think that kind of vision is playing with a sort of, you're actually seeing it through the AI's perspective. But that notion that the AI took over the film and that's why it's propaganda for, although I don't quite, I mean, the end is messy and interesting and contradictory, but I guess there is a sense in which there's a sort of, you know, propagandistic, I mean, it sort of just resolves itself without resolving the sort of ideological tensions, which is interesting in itself. But no, I love that, I was watching some terrible, it wasn't terrible, it was fine, but it was a video essay that was suggesting that because it's will caster, and it was saying that like that's because they're casting their will over things or something, which is yeah. Interesting. But yeah, that conspiracy is better than what I thought. That's great. Thank you, Elaine. And yeah, Katerina, do you want to come in on the relationship to Cronenberg?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it might sound like a little bit irrelevant, but I just happened to thought about it, like, because I also recently watched his film, like Videodrome.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it reminds me of the protagonist there, where he's like a regular employee at a TV company, and he started to watch, like, or I don't know, he ended up watching like very violent TV show, and that led him being like totally consumed by it. And you would see, like, I don't know if anyone has watched it, but you would see like losing his identity. He was like spiraling over like hallucinations throughout the film, where the TV is coming out of the box and like consuming him. And yeah, this is like what I'm wondering is like, yeah, if we're using technology, or in the end is like, is technology using us? And this also reminds me of a book by Marshall McLuhan, the Understanding the Media or something like that. I don't know, how is it called? And there is somewhere that he mentions that basically, like, if we surrender ourselves to technology, then we don't really have any rights left.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting one. I think I was talking to someone about that film like today or yesterday. I mean, again, and this could be a film, if you wanted to write about it, that'd be amazing. To sort of think through how it's human machine relationships is, I think, deeply entwined with questions of intelligence, precisely because the sort of notions of intelligence and rationality and sort of sapience to do with sort of like tool use and to do with sort of technological development, I think is like vital for the course and for understanding those kinds of questions. Yeah, I mean, I want to open it up to sort of anyone else who wants to talk about sort of maybe things off this topic, or sort of like, there's also, I sort of set quite a bit of reading. There were two main ones, which was the People from Dale essay. There's also the one on sort of film as thinking, which sort of was quite like a intense tour through a sort of series of sort of started with Gilles Deleuze, Jean Epstein, and then forward to sort of like fields of sense, questions of sort of the post-human. Yeah, just wanted to open it up for if anyone if there's anything in the reading anybody wanted to bring up and talk about, so you have space to do so. How did people find the reading, and I do want to know what you think of this sort of film can think kind of perspective, because it's, as I said, it's me coming from this kind of film philosophy tradition that's sort of deeply invested in that idea, and working out the forms of thought that cinema makes possible. So I kind of want, there's a sense in which these films can help us think about those ideas, but I also want us to think about, if as much as you want to, right, that sense of like film, specific medium as a specific technology, as well as just a representational device, I guess. But yeah, how do people find the reading? Is there anything? Wanted to open it for discussion on that. And you can put stuff in the chat if it works as well. And the Google Classroom, I haven't checked that one. So is film artificial intelligence? That's the question.
I'm still digesting the wolf piece, which I really appreciated. Thank you for all of them. I think they're fantastic. And I think, there's been kind of a revisitation of the Deleuze cinema volumes there's a really great piece that I think a couple of issues ago in CinemaScope magazine, kind of that people are revisiting Cinema 1 and Cinema 2. And again, I haven't processed this fully because I was just kind of moving through the pieces rather more quickly than I would have liked to. So I need to sit with them again a little bit more. But I suppose that this notion of cinema as thinking, not just thinking with it or being provoked to think, it also, you know, and again, it also invites, you know, it gets into these object-oriented ontology spaces in interesting ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, because the sort of I mean, the way I always think about it is the sense in which, you know, I almost think that there's a kind of, I can't remember the word I used to use to describe it, the kind of, there's a statement. I think I probably got it from a misunderstanding of Hegel, but like speculative statement or something, where you sort of say film thinks in the same way you say like God is infinite or something, but neither of those terms are defined. So they're kind of like both terms then enter into this sort of like negotiation where they kind of define each other in different ways. And I like that way of approaching it. For me, that way in which cinema is a form of thinking or is a mode of perception that's different, that then revitalizes, reorders, ruptures, all those different sort of words that would define the different ways it does. So it shifts how we think, is really interesting to me. I mean, there's Christian Pieces' piece is kind of interesting in this sense because it goes to Jean Epstein and Gilles Deleuze. I mean, Jean Epstein, someone that I read about as well, who's sort of bizarre notions of cinema and its sort of like its creation of an anti-universe and its creation of an anti-philosophy, and it can finally envision the world without causality, and it can go really quickly, and it can sort of rupture all of our notions of sense and perception. It's been interpreted in lots of different ways, and this is a quite strong post-humanist reading of that suggests that, you know, in that sort of mode of thinking where intelligence isn't the sort of in the grips of the human, it's something which we can spread out to matter, we can spread it out to sort of a function of sense that other things do. Then Jean Epstein is seen as sort of prefiguring these sort of speculative materialist philosophies in some ways. It's not necessarily the reading of him that I have. I think there's a sense in which it's sort of, I mean, we'll see this. Maybe I've egotistically put my own essay in next week's reading. If you have time to read that, maybe put that one at the end. I don't want to, but there's a slightly different reading where it's sort of, you know, where is intelligence happening, or where is sapience, or where is the development of rationality happening? Epstein also talks about how cinema's like, he compares at the beginning of this, the intelligence of machine to sort of like, we've got the sort of telescope, we've got the microscope. What's cinema going to do for this? It's this sort of scientific instrument which creates a new mode of perception that revitalizes and uproots our own. So I think there's links between this and that reading, but there's different ways of reading this, and I think this is an interesting, if intense and quite strong reading of the sort of AI question. But yeah, anyone want to come in on their thoughts on the piece?
Yeah, maybe I can say I mean, yeah, I wasn't aware of Sean Epstein before, but I thought the text was very interesting. I guess like what stood out to me was, as far as I understood, kind of like this particular reading of Epstein is like there's kind of you have to generalize like kind of if the film can think, like what's kind of radical about that, or kind of what points to something like something that's useful is that it can kind of supersede, as you say, like kind of time and space, which are maybe, or like kind of our conceptions of time and space, which are maybe kind of the Kantian a priori kind of categories, or whatever, which are maybe not kind of intelligence as such, but kind of an incarnate intelligence, like they kind of get us out of that space. But then like the kind of, I guess it also made me think of like this Bernard Stiegler concept of like cinematic mode of experience somehow. So like on the flip side, you also have kind of this like time that kind of transcends like our kind of a priori notion of time, that is faster or that is kind of multiple or whatever. So somehow like actually in Stiegler's case, it like actually it's like it's completely like well, it functions as spectacle, but the fact that like we have to operate at a time that we cannot really kind of comprehend, the cinematic time. So we sit and watch the movie instead of like engaging in activity kind of on our own time. I'm not like articulating well enough, but what I'm saying is like this kind of again like the figure of the human and like the subject kind of comes in because on the one hand you have like a kind of thinking which can transcend time. On the other hand, you have like a time which is like historic and specific that seems to like put us in a passive consumerist kind of position of you know what I mean? Like there's a kind of like there's a tension there, I think, which is like kind of interesting to follow through with.
No, absolutely. And that's sort of, I sort of specifically like 70s film theory and that kind of question of sort of how to critique film along that lines of the sort of the aspects of control, aspects of interpolation, and the sort of passive spectator. I think is a really important thing to recognize. I mean, it's that sort of historical aspect of it I think is really interesting, and I'd so recommend reading Sean Epstein's book. It's wild and amazing, and it's really great. And his films as well, like he was also a practical filmmaker, a filmmaker, and his films precisely aren't about that, which is interesting, right? Like for him, cinema wasn't story, it was like pure effect, pure sort of like shifting how you see the world. Photogeny was his concept of like film, what film does to objects, and what it's sort of like, it gives them this moral character, it gives them souls, it sort of like changes things in the world in lots of different ways, which is very different to the sort of the questions of like commercial film, questions of sort of ideological exacerbation that happens through passivity. So I think you're completely correct in sort of like thinking through that. And what's interesting about the end of the piece that I've forgotten about is the Repeaters piece, is that it ends with sort of like how might filmmakers use the potential thinking of film to sort of, I don't want to say to think, because that feels more like directorial kind of control of the film, but to let it think or something like that. So there's like a filmmakery point as well, which is precisely, I mean, getting into your question through the notion of, we're talking about genres, we're talking about different kinds of films, we're talking about sort of how film can be wielded across those different potentials and dangers. I don't know if I made sense. That was a really good point though, thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that, or what they thought of film as thinking? Because I'm interested, especially because I mean we'll sort of go through sort of where everyone's sort of from and sort of disciplines and sort of how this will sort of work out, but it is ensconced in that kind of film philosophy perspective. And if you think it's, it doesn't have to make any sense, or you don't have to agree with it as a sort of starting point for analysis. I think it's one that I'm interested to see where you kind of stand or think, or is it something you've already thought through, this sort of like thinking cinema kind of thing? I also do realize we've been going for quite a while, so I do want to give everybody space to say everything they want to say, but also not keep you for too long, because it has been, I think, something like 2.5 hours. So and I don't know what time zones you're at. It's 9:30. It's 9:30 in the evening for me, so it's almost my bedtime anyway. But has anybody? I don't want to sort of cut anybody off if anybody had other thoughts that they want to say, and also any questions, because I put up the assessments. Again, they're very broad. The final. I mean, I think the text presentations are usually the same, which is present on one of the texts from that week. As I said, I've added that ideally with a scene from the film to sort of anchor you within the sort of filmic text. And then the essay is sort of for you to pick your own film. And there's already been some incredibly good examples that people have brought in this week. So I can already see sort of essays forming, hopefully. But I want to just give some space now for if there's anything we didn't talk about that people wanted to talk about, or if you have any sort of immediate questions about the essay or how the next few weeks will function. I just want to give a little space for that now. And then Pradeep, how does it work with the logistics of groups and things like this? Is this something, do you want to?
So I'll be sorting that out. That won't that'll be pretty sorted. By this weekend or hopefully tomorrow, I'll be sending out a mail where I'll mention all of the details to the participants. You'll receive an Excel sheet from my end where all the authors that you have sort of given will be mentioned, and all the participants can sort of map them down within the spreadsheet with regards to authors. So 3 people usually picking up one author, presenting in groups, usually a 5 to 10 minutes presentation. 6 to 10 minutes presentation, around 100,000 words, something of that sort. Yeah, I think that is, you've already mentioned the final assignment, so that's pretty solid then. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, any final points? I think Pradeep will, yeah, is there anything else I've missed logistically, or is that? Yeah, any final points before we bring things to a close? I mean, I'm really excited. I've already started to, the film makes more and less sense already in a good way. So thank you. Any final points before we finish? Yes, John, thank you so much. Yeah, looking forward to our next sessions. Yeah, thank you. Good. Well, Pradeep, do you want to bring things to an end, and is there anything for next week we need to think about?
Yeah, no, pretty solid. Thank you everyone for attending the seminar. I'll be sending out a mail with the logistics. If there are any questions with regards to your presentations or the final submission, if it is a technical question, I'll be able to respond, or if it's something with regards to the final assignment itself, I mean, in terms of content and regarding the seminar, I think Laurence will be the best person to respond in that case. So the mails are quite open. Mail will be the best way in which you can sort of connect. Everything will be recorded in loop and people will be informed, so that'll be great. Yes. Thank you,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I look so much. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you. Have a good week and enjoy. See you soon.
Thank you.